Welcome to our Geologic Natural Hazards lecture on earthquakes. I'd like to start out, as with all of these lectures on natural hazards, talking about what are the hazards and why do we worry about this hazard. So with earthquakes, a primary concern we have is that they lead to a loss of life or injury when structures fall, such as buildings, bridges, or even trees. And so in this picture here, we see the collapse of a roadbed on the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge during the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. And indeed, people were traveling across this bridge at the time of the earthquake, and it killed a number of people and smashed many cars. Earthquakes can also trigger landslides, which can bury people, animals, homes, and more. And this is particularly hazardous in mountainous regions and areas where you have a lot of unstable earth. Tsunamis are a large killer of people during earthquakes, and this is, of course, is a big wave that travels up out of the ocean after an earthquake. And we will talk about that more in another lecture. So, according to the United States Geological Survey, earthquakes do pose a significant risk to about 75 million Americans spread over 39 different states. Earthquakes are caused where you have a fault where two tectonic plates are moving past one another. As these plates move past one another, there is friction between the two plates, the rocks along those plates, and so they don't move freely, and this causes pressure to build up along the two plates. Eventually, movement will occur after enough energy builds up along that fault line, and when that happens, that causes an earthquake. Volcanic eruptions are also a second cause of earthquakes. So in this picture, we see the San Andreas Fault, and you can see that the fault on the eastern side is moving south, whereas the fault on the western side is moving north. So they're moving opposite directions. There are three different types of faults. Primarily, there's the strike-slip fault, in which two tectonic plates are moving past one another horizontally, and then there's also the normal and thrust faults, and in both of these cases one plate is being pushed up compared to another plate, or being pulled down, so one plate is moving up compared to the other. And if you'd like to see animations of these processes, I am including a link to a website that you can look at to see these in action. So I did want to provide a little bit of earthquake trivia. First of all, which state do you think is the most earthquake prone? Well, if you said Alaska, you are right. Alaska is the most earthquake prone state, and this would make sense since it also has some of the largest populations of volcanoes. Another question that's related, where was the largest earthquake ever recorded in the United States? And remember that earthquake magnitudes have only been measured and recorded in the relatively recent past. Okay, so if you said Alaska again, then you'd be right. The Great Alaskan Earthquake of 1964 was the largest quake recorded in the United States. It measured 9.2 on the Richter scale. Some of you may have heard of the San Francisco earthquake of 1906 that killed about 3,000 people. This quake only measured 7.8 on the Richter scale for comparison, but there were a lot more people living in this area where the earthquake took place, and that's what made the difference. Here you can see a picture of the J.C. Penney store in Anchorage, Alaska, right after the 1964 earthquake in Alaska. And so it was a multi-story structure, and you can see how the walls on one side just fell off, and the one side of the store is just open to the air now. I also like this picture. It's an aerial photo of damage to the downtown Anchorage, Alaska area. This is L Street, and you can see a crack in the ground where the ground was shaking so violently that it literally put a big crack down the center of downtown and shifted houses. Okay, so after we talked so much about Alaska and we talked about Hawaii with volcanoes, You might think that only cities on the west coast are near the ring of fire are also at risk for earthquakes, but this is actually false. In northeast Arkansas and southeast Missouri, the New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 to 1812 ranked as some of the largest in the U.S. history since the U.S. was settled by Europeans. Um, these were estimated to be 2 to 3 times as large in terms of the surface area that they impacted, as large as compared to the 1964 Alaskan earthquake, and they were 10 times as large as the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. So in other words, they weren't as strong, but they were more widespread and they impacted a larger surface area. And the New Madrid earthquakes were the largest earthquakes that we know of east of the Rocky Mountains in the US and Canada. I have a map here so you can see where this New Madrid seismic zone is. And it's south of St. Louis and north of Memphis, Tennessee. So it's kind of at the border of Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and actually part of Indiana too. So people who live in that area really need to be aware of this as a threat because this fault is still considered to be active, and it could have another large earthquake. So this leads me to our last slide, which is a look at the earthquake hazards map for the United States, just so you can see where the highest hazards are for earthquakes. Of course, California, which you know about, is at very high risk for earthquakes. So is Washington, and so the city of Seattle is at high risk. Alaska and Hawaii are at high risk, and then that New Madrid Fault area in the Midwestern states is also at high risk for earthquakes. So the states with the least risk are Florida, Minnesota, North Dakota, Michigan, Wisconsin. So if you live in those states or if your family is from those states, then you can rest easy that those aren't at very high risk for earthquakes. Okay, so that wraps up our earthquake lecture. Thanks for listening.